The young woman who braved the storm to reach the Duke carried a message that could save his life. The market of Little Ashford lay fractured beneath the autumn deluge, its modest stalls collapsing into themselves like wounded creatures. Rain fell with the fury of judgment, and amongst the chaos of abandoned goods and fleeing merchants stood Miss Clara Harbury, her gloved hands gripping a letter sealed in crimson wax as though it were the last anchor to her soul. "Unfit for decent commerce," bellowed old Merchant Thorne, his voice cutting through the storm like a blade. "A woman standing alone in such weather, what manner of impropriety is this? The Reverend shall hear of it." Clara's jaw tightened, but she did not answer. Her modest wool dress, damp and clinging, bore the marks of her journey from the schoolhouse where she served as her father's assistant. The letter, this terrible, essential letter, had arrived by private courier, just as dawn broke. Its origin was unmistakable. The seal of Wexford Hall, though weather-beaten now, remained legible upon its face. The whispers began before she had walked 10 paces from the market square. Heads turned, fingers pointed, and the ancient machinery of village judgment commenced its work. A woman unaccompanied, carrying correspondence from a duke's household, such a sight invited only one interpretation in the minds of the pious and the envious alike. "She carries his mark," someone hissed. Her sealed letter from the hall itself. Clara's cheeks burned, but not with shame, with purpose, with the terrible knowledge that what lay within that envelope might determine whether Edmund Ashworth, the Duke of Wexford, lived through the week. The storm intensified as she left the village proper, climbing toward the moorland roads that led northward to the ducal estate. The wind tore at her bonnet, and more than once she stumbled upon the slick earth. Yet she pressed forward, her steps becoming a rhythm, a chant. Reach him, reach him, reach him. The letter she held close to her heart, beneath her wool cloak, as though her own warmth might preserve its secrets. She had known the Duke, though not intimately, for nearly 3 years. He had come to the village school once to present books to her father's modest library. She remembered his grey-green eyes moving across the volumes with genuine interest, not the perfunctory gesture of duty she had witnessed in other nobles. He had spoken to her father with respect, as though a schoolmaster's knowledge held equal weight to his own. That kindness had been the beginning of her understanding. Then, 6 weeks ago, the letters began. Anonymous at first, left in her father's study, warning of treachery within the Duke's own household. A steward embezzling funds meant for tenant relief, a solicitor altering documents, a conspiracy to convince the Duke that his own judgment had failed, that his mind weakened, so that his younger cousin might assume stewardship of the vast Wexford holdings. And then, this morning, the final letter, written in the Duke's own urgent hand, brought by a trusted servant who trusted only her. "Miss Harbury," it began, "if you have received the preceding warnings, you alone know their source to be genuine. I am called to London on false pretense. By the time I return, the forged documents will be presented to the Committee of Peers, and my authority will be questioned beyond repair. I must ask what propriety forbids. Bring me proof. Bring me the ledgers. I do not ask this lightly, nor do I ask it of any woman in my household who might be exposed to suspicion. Yet you are the only soul I trust with this burden." The path climbed steeply now, and Clara's breath came in ragged gasps. The storm showed no mercy. Lightning fractured the sky, and in its white glare she saw the silhouette of Wexford Hall, its turrets piercing the darkness like prayers. She had stolen into the steward's office at dawn, before any servant stirred. The ledgers were hidden, as the anonymous letters had indicated, beneath floorboards in a panelled closet. She had photographed the pages using the small camera her father had given her, a modern miracle of engineering. The photographs, along with copies of the Duke's letter and the original incriminating entries, now rested in a leather satchel beneath her cloak. As she approached the great gates, a figure emerged from the lodge, a man on horseback, riding against the storm. "Miss Harbury?" His voice was startled, almost disbelieving. "What in God's name brings you to this place in such weather?" It was Lord Harrington, the Duke's friend and adviser. She had met him once at a village assembly, a gentleman of perhaps 35, with kind eyes and the bearing of one accustomed to command. "I must see the Duke," she said, her voice steadier than her hands. "It is a matter of gravest importance." He dismounted, extending his hand. "You shall catch your death. Come, the hall is but 100 yards. The Duke is within, though he prepares even now to depart for London." As he helped her to his horse, Clara felt the letter shift beneath her cloak. The wax seal, though dampened, held firm. In that moment, shielded slightly by Lord Harrington's broad shoulders as they rode toward the illuminated windows of the hall, she understood with crystalline certainty that she had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. Her reputation, her standing in the village, her carefully preserved anonymity, all of it hung now upon the truth contained in that crimson seal, and as the great doors of Wexford Hall swung open before her, she heard, somewhere within, the sound of voices raised in dispute. The Hall of Wexford was a cathedral of shadows and candlelight. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors regarded Clara's entrance with what she could only interpret as disapproval. The marble floors, slick from the autumn air, echoed beneath her sodden boots, and she was acutely conscious of the rivulets of rainwater tracing paths across the pristine stone. "Miss Harbury," a voice emerged from the darkness, controlled, surprised, bearing undertones of something Clara could not yet name. "Your presence here is both unexpected and, I confess, most welcome." Edmund Ashworth, Duke of Wexford, descended the grand staircase with the fluid grace of a man born to authority. His dark coat was impeccably fitted, his cravat precisely knotted, yet his eyes, those grey-green eyes Clara remembered, held the exhaustion of a man besieged by doubt. A faint scar traced his left temple, a remnant of some old wound, and it moved slightly as he studied her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Your Grace," she managed, curtsying despite her sodden state, despite the impropriety of it all. "I have come bearing—" "You are drenched to the bone," he interrupted, and there was concern in his voice, genuine and unguarded. He turned to the figure emerging behind him, Mrs. Margaret Linton, the house steward, her practical frame and sharp eyes suggesting she missed nothing. "Mrs. Linton, hot water and every dry garment that might serve Miss Harbury. Now." "At once, Your Grace," the steward replied, though her gaze lingered upon Clara with an assessment that felt like judgment and recognition mingled together. "Come," the Duke said, extending his hand. "My study is warmer. We shall see what has driven you to such extraordinary lengths." The study was indeed warm, a refuge lined with leather-bound volumes and lit by a generous fire. The Duke closed the door, a gesture that would have been scandalous in any circumstance Clara could have imagined. Yet in this moment, with the storm howling beyond the windows and her hands trembling from cold and the weight of her secret, it felt not improper, but essential. "You know of the conspiracy," he said. It was not a question. "How?" Clara withdrew the satchel from beneath her cloak, her fingers barely steady. "I received warnings, Your Grace, anonymous communications detailing the embezzlement, the forged documents. This morning, I received your letter." A shadow crossed his face. "I should not have asked it of you. The moment I pressed pen to paper, I recognized the cruelty of my own desperation." "It is not cruel to trust those who prove worthy of trust," Clara replied, and was surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. She opened the satchel, revealing the photographs, the copies, the evidence of betrayal within his own household. "Your steward, Mr. Vickers, and your solicitor, Mr. Crane, have been collaborating to present forged accounts to the Committee of Peers. They intend to convince the Council that you are incapable of managing your own estates." The Duke took the photographs from her hands. Their fingers touched, and Clara felt a peculiar warmth blossom where they met, and examined them with the focused intensity of a general reading battle plans. His jaw tightened, his knuckles whitened against the aged paper. "This is treason against my own house," he said quietly, "and you have risked everything to bring me proof." "I risk what was already forfeit," Clara replied. "The moment I traveled here alone, the moment I carried your letter, the village judgment was already rendered. My reputation is no longer mine to protect. At least it may serve a purpose." He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and Clara saw in his eyes something that shifted the very axis of her understanding. It was not gratitude alone, though gratitude was present. It was recognition, as though he saw in her not the modest schoolmaster's daughter, but something of greater consequence. "You speak as though your sacrifice is merely practical," he said, "as though you did not understand that you have placed yourself in the very teeth of scandal." "I understood perfectly, Your Grace," Clara whispered. "I chose to understand it, and to act regardless." A knock at the door interrupted them. Mrs. Linton, bearing dry garments and hot tea. The steward's expression remained neutral, but her eyes gleamed with information she would soon be sharing in the servants' quarters. "I shall arrange transport to your home," the Duke said, as Mrs. Linton withdrew, "with proper escort and witnesses. We shall frame this journey as a visit conducted with full propriety, a consultation regarding the schoolhouse library, nothing more." "Will anyone believe it?" Clara asked. "Perhaps not," he admitted. "But we shall deny the alternative with sufficient conviction that doubt is permitted to flourish, and by tomorrow When the false documents are presented to the committee, we shall be prepared with evidence that reduces Vickers and Crane to discredited liars. He moved to the window, gazing into the tempest beyond. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, edged with something vulnerable. There are few souls in this world who would risk what you have risked for the sake of honor, he said. Fewer still who would do so for a man they scarcely know. I do not know if gratitude is a sufficient response to such courage. I fear it is not. Clara rose, her borrowed dress still damp in places, her hair escaping its pins. Your Grace, I have not come seeking reward or recognition. I have come because what you face is an injustice, and because silence would have been a betrayal of all that I believe myself to be. He turned from the window, and in the firelight his face bore an expression of such intensity that Clara's breath stilled within her breast. Then know this, Miss Harbury, he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. What you have done this night will not be forgotten, not by me, not ever. At that precise moment, there came a sharp knock at the study door, the kind of urgent, authoritative knock that signaled the interruption of something profound. The door swung open without waiting for permission. Reverend Silas Merrow stood upon the threshold, his narrow frame silhouetted against the hallway light, his expression a portrait of righteous fury. Your Grace, the Reverend began, his voice dripping with ecclesiastical authority, I have come with grave news regarding— His words halted as his eyes fell upon Clara, still draped in borrowed finery, her hair loosened, and her composure visibly unsettled. The Reverend's thin lips curved into something that might have been a smile had it not been so weaponized. Miss Harbury, how singular, how very singular indeed. The Duke stepped forward, positioning himself subtly between the Reverend and Clara, a gesture so small that only Clara noticed it, and only Clara understood what it signified. A shield, a declaration. Reverend Merrow, the Duke said, his tone clipped with the authority that came from generations of aristocratic command. Your presence is unexpected at this hour. The hour is late, the storm is considerable, and my household is not prepared for visitors. The hour is precisely why I have come, the Reverend replied, advancing into the study with the presumption of one who believed his moral mandate superseded the boundaries of courtesy. I have received reports, reliable reports, Your Grace, that Miss Harbury was observed entering your estates alone in weather most unseemly, carrying correspondence of an intimate nature. Surely you comprehend the implications of such conduct. Clara felt her face flush with a heat that had nothing to do with the study's fire. She opened her mouth to speak, but the Duke raised his hand, a gesture so subtle that the Reverend did not perceive it. The implications, the Duke said quietly, are that a loyal member of this village possessed knowledge of matters pertaining to the administration of my estates, and that in her commitment to honor, she traveled here to ensure that certain unpleasant facts came to my attention. Miss Harbury has acted with integrity. If your village gossip suggests otherwise, then the fault lies not with her conduct, but with the narrowness of provincial minds. The Reverend's face reddened. Your Grace, propriety dictates— Propriety, the Duke interrupted, and there was steel in his voice now, the sound of a man no longer soliciting but declaring, is a framework designed to protect virtue, not to punish it. If you would suggest that this young woman's virtue has been compromised by her courageous honesty, then I must tell you plainly that your understanding of virtue is as corrupted as the conduct she has come to expose. Silence fell, the kind of profound silence that follows a thunderclap. The Reverend's hands trembled slightly, and Clara saw something flicker across his face, the uncertainty of a man who has overextended his authority and found it insufficient. I shall speak with you further on this matter, Your Grace, the Reverend said, his voice stripped of its certainty. There are other members of the village who will require explanation. Then explain to them this, the Duke replied, moving to his desk and withdrawing a document bearing his ducal seal. Miss Harbury is engaged in performing a service of considerable importance to this household. Her discretion and her presence here are wholly authorized and entirely proper. Any suggestion to the contrary constitutes slander against a woman of spotless character, and such slander will be met with the full weight of legal consequence. The Reverend took the document with visibly shaking fingers. He read it, and Clara watched as the man's authority shriveled before her eyes, replaced by the petulant uncertainty of one who had gambled and lost. I had only the welfare of the parish in mind, he muttered. Then tend to the welfare of the parish, the Duke said coldly, by ensuring that no further baseless accusations reach the ears of its inhabitants. Miss Harbury will be escorted home by my household staff. with witnesses and with all the marks of propriety that even you, Reverend, cannot question. Is this understood?" The Reverend departed without further word, his cassock sweeping behind him like the tail of a wounded animal. When the door had closed, Clara released the breath she did not know she had been holding. "He will spread rumors regardless," she said quietly. "Undoubtedly," the Duke acknowledged, "but he will do so knowing that they lack the force of authority, that his accusations are met with contrary evidence, and that the village itself will be divided in its judgment of you. Doubt, Miss Harbury, is the great solvent of certainty, and in villages, as in courts, doubt is infinitely preferable to conviction." He returned to his desk and wrote quickly, his pen moving with decisive strokes across the paper. When he finished, he turned the letter toward her, and Clara read the words that bore his signature. "To the people of Little Ashford and beyond, let it be known that Miss Clara Harbury, daughter of the village schoolmaster, has rendered signal service to this household in a matter of considerable delicacy. Her courage, her integrity, and her unwavering commitment to justice have earned my deepest respect and gratitude. Any attack upon her character is an attack upon my own, and will be answered accordingly. Edmund Ashworth, Duke of Wexford." Clara's eyes blurred with unshed tears as she read the words. In that single act, the Duke had not merely defended her, he had elevated her, given her standing that even the Reverend's malice could not diminish. "Your Grace," she began, her voice trembling. "Do not thank me," he said softly. "There is no gratitude sufficient for what you have given me, not merely evidence, but the gift of knowing that such honor still exists in this world." He extended his hand to her, and when she placed her palm against his, she felt in that touch something that transcended the careful protocols of Victorian propriety. It was a connection forged in crisis and crystallized in mutual recognition. "Tomorrow," he said, "all shall be resolved. The committee shall see the truth. And then—" He paused, and his eyes held hers with an intensity that seemed to burn away the very air between them. "Then we shall speak of matters that extend far beyond ledgers and conspiracies." The unfinished sentence hung in the firelit air, like a promise, or perhaps a question. Outside the storm raged on, but within the study of Wexford Hall, a new tempest had been born, one of the heart, and far more dangerous than any mere weather. Dawn broke grey and reluctant over Wexford Hall, the storm having exhausted itself into sullen drizzle. Clara had been given a small guest chamber in the east wing, a room deliberately positioned far from the private apartments, a concession to propriety that felt both protective and isolating. She had not slept. Her mind had moved in endless circles, replaying the Reverend's arrival, the Duke's defense of her, and most of all that final moment when his eyes had held hers with an intensity that seemed to contain entire conversations. By 8 o'clock she had dressed in her own clothes, now dry and carefully pressed by the household staff, and made her way to the breakfast room. The Duke was already there, accompanied by Lord Harrington, and both men rose as she entered. Their expressions were grave with purpose. "Miss Harbury," the Duke began, gesturing for her to take a seat, "the committee convenes at 2 o'clock this afternoon in the Great Library. The forged documents will be presented. We have perhaps 6 hours to ensure that our evidence is irrefutable." Lord Harrington unrolled a set of ledgers across the breakfast table, displaying the contradictions between the falsified accounts and the genuine records Clara had copied. "The scheme is elegant in its villainy," he said with a mixture of admiration and disgust. "Vickers has been gradually redirecting funds meant for tenant relief into accounts bearing his cousin's name. Crane has been forging the Duke's signature upon orders that would justify the transfers. Had they succeeded in convincing the committee that the Duke was mentally unstable, they would have positioned the cousin as regent, and the embezzlement would have become invisible." "How much has been stolen?" Clara asked. "Nearly £40,000 over 5 years, the Duke replied, his voice carrying the weight of that figure. "Money that should have restored cottages, purchased seed for spring planting, provided medicines for the ill. Instead, it has lined the pockets of men I believed I trusted." Clara felt a tremor of something, not quite anger, but its close cousin, move through her. "Then we must present the evidence with such clarity that no committee member can doubt its authenticity." "There remains one difficulty," the Duke said, and Clara heard the careful restraint in his voice. "The committee will question how we came to possess copies of private ledgers. The answer, that you obtained them, places you at the center of this scandal. When the newspapers report on the affair, your name will be mentioned. Your presence here at the hall will be subject to the most salacious interpretations." Clara met his gaze steadily. "Your Grace, I have already accepted the cost of my honesty. I do not regret it. Lord Harrington cleared his throat delicately. The committee is composed of men who understand the demands of duty, he said. If we frame your actions as consultation regarding estate matters, a confidential matter, yes, but a professional one, the narrative becomes considerably more defensible. It is not a lie, the Duke said, merely an incomplete truth. Miss Harbury was indeed consulting upon matters of consequence to the estate. The specificity of her consultation simply exceeds what propriety might comfortably acknowledge. The morning passed in meticulous preparation. Clara and Lord Harrington worked alongside the Duke, organizing the evidence, rehearsing the presentation, ensuring that every ledger entry could be matched against the false documents. It was exacting work, requiring precision and clarity, and Clara found herself falling into a rhythm that felt almost comfortable, the familiar work of her father's school office magnified to grand proportion. Yet throughout the morning, she remained acutely conscious of the Duke's presence. He would pause beside her, ostensibly to examine a document, but their hands would brush as they turned pages, and she would feel a current of something pass between them, acknowledgement, perhaps, or longing held in careful check by the demands of propriety and circumstance. By 1 o'clock, the Duke withdrew to dress for the committee. Clara found herself in the library, the great library where the committee would soon convene, examining the room's proportions as though committing them to memory. The space was noble and imposing, with high ceilings and tall windows that admitted the pale autumn light. The bookshelves rose in orderly ranks, and Clara found herself drawn to a volume that lay upon a reading desk, Tennyson's poems, marked at a particular page. She read the passage that had been marked. "For I myself with these have grown to something greater than before." "You know his work?" a voice asked from behind her. She turned to find the Duke, now dressed formally in dark wool and the insignia of his rank, regarding her with an expression of gentle inquiry. "My father loves Tennyson," Clara replied. "I have heard these lines before, in his study, recited in the evening when his students had departed. There is profound wisdom in them," the Duke said, moving to stand beside her at the window. "The suggestion that we are not fixed creatures, that we grow and transform through our encounters with others. I have been thinking of that passage since last evening. I believe it to be true." Clara's heart quickened. "Your Grace, Edmund," he interrupted softly, "if we are to face what comes next, if we are to navigate the tempest that will surely follow this afternoon's revelations, then I would ask that you grant me the privilege of hearing my name upon your lips. In private moments when propriety is not being observed, simply Edmund." The intimacy of the request, the vulnerability it contained, struck Clara with unexpected force. "Edmund," she whispered, and felt the word settle into a place within her that she had not known was empty. "Clara," he replied, and his voice held such tenderness that she felt it as a physical thing. "What comes today will change everything. After the committee hears our evidence, after the scandal erupts and the village voices rise in judgment, there will be a period, perhaps a lengthy one, when proximity between us will be scrutinized with utmost severity. I need you to understand this. I need you to know that what I feel toward you, what has begun to crystallize in my breast since the moment you entered this hall drenched and determined, must wait. It must be patient. It must be silent." "Then I shall make silence my companion," Clara replied, though the words cost her dearly. "I shall wait however long propriety demands." He raised her gloved hand to his lips, a gesture that lasted a fraction longer than courtesy would permit, and Clara felt in that touch the full weight of his restraint and the passion it contained. "The committee awaits," he said finally. "Let us speak truth to power, and let the consequences fall where they may." Together they turned toward the great doors of the library, where history was preparing to unfold. The library transformed into a courtroom of sorts, with 12 committee members seated behind a long table of polished mahogany. Their faces bore the expressions of men accustomed to power and reluctant to yield their certainty. At the far end of the table sat the Duke's cousin, Mr. Reginald Ashworth, his features composed into an appearance of concern, a masterpiece of theatrical deception that Clara recognized immediately. The committee's chairman, Lord Pemberton, a gentleman of perhaps 70 years, with white whiskers and eyes of crystalline blue, opened the proceedings with grave formality. "Your Grace, we have been presented with documentation suggesting that your management of the Wexford estates has become impaired. Certain inconsistencies in the accounts, certain orders that appear to contravene your established practices. We are here to examine these concerns with the utmost discretion." The Duke rose, and Clara noted the controlled grace with which he moved, no emotion visible upon his face, though she recognized now the subtle tension in his shoulders, the barely perceptible tightening at the corners of his mouth. "I am grateful for your discretion, gentlemen," he began. "However, I must inform you that the documentation you have been presented contains calculated falsifications. I possess evidence, irrefutable evidence, that my steward, Mr. Vickers, and my solicitor, Mr. Crane, have conspired to defraud my estates of approximately £40,000. Moreover, they have fabricated documents bearing my signature, with the explicit intention of convincing this committee that I am mentally incapable of managing my own affairs." A murmur rippled through the chamber. Lord Pemberton's eyes narrowed with sudden wariness. Reginald Ashworth's face flushed with anger. He had not expected the attack to come so swiftly, so comprehensively. "These are grave accusations, Your Grace," Lord Pemberton said carefully. "Do you possess documentation to support them?" The Duke nodded to Lord Harrington, who stepped forward bearing the ledgers and the photographic evidence. The committee members leaned forward with the intensity of men who understood that what they were about to examine might reshape the entire foundation of their assumptions. As Lord Harrington presented each piece of evidence, Clara watched the committee's collective certainty begin to crumble. The contradictions between the falsified accounts and the genuine records were unmistakable. The forged signatures, when placed alongside legitimate examples of the Duke's handwriting, revealed obvious discrepancies. The timing of the fraudulent transfers aligned precisely with Vickers's access to the accounts. "Furthermore," Lord Harrington declared, "we possess copies of correspondence between Mr. Vickers and Mr. Crane detailing their strategy. They are arranged chronologically, revealing the development of their scheme across a period of 5 years. One committee member, a gentleman introduced as Sir Frederick Ashby, leaned back in his chair, regarding the Duke with an expression of mingled relief and admiration. "Your Grace, this is exceptionally thorough documentation. Might I inquire as to its source? How came you to possess such detailed copies?" The Duke paused, a hesitation so brief that only Clara, who knew his mannerisms with intimacy now, recognized it as intentional. "The source must remain confidential," he said. "A person of considerable integrity and loyalty to this household identified inconsistencies in the accounts and brought them to my attention. I cannot in good conscience expose that individual to the scrutiny that such revelation would inevitably invite." Clara held her breath, waiting for the inevitable demand for clarification, but Sir Frederick nodded slowly, understanding passing across his weathered features. "I see. Well, conscience does you credit, Your Grace. The integrity of your source is evident in the quality and accuracy of their work." Reginald Ashworth rose abruptly, his composed facade shattered. "This is a fabrication," he cried. "Your Grace has merely constructed an elaborate deception to preserve his authority. I demand that these documents be submitted to independent examination." "By all means," the Duke replied calmly. "I encourage the committee to submit them to the most rigorous scrutiny. The truth, gentlemen, does not fear examination. It welcomes it." Lord Pemberton gathered the materials before him, his expression unreadable. "We shall require time to conduct a thorough investigation," he said. "However, I must state plainly that the evidence presented by His Grace bears all the hallmarks of authenticity. In contrast, the documents previously submitted appear increasingly suspect. We shall reconvene in 1 week's time with our findings. In the interim, I must recommend that Mr. Vickers and Mr. Crane be suspended from their duties pending the completion of our inquiry." As the committee members began to gather their materials, several approached the Duke privately. Clara observed Sir Frederick clasp his shoulder with unmistakable respect. Another gentleman, Lord Ashford, whispered words that she could not hear, but whose tone conveyed apology and contrition. When the committee had finally departed, the Duke stood alone at the centre of the great library, and Clara saw him allow the mask of composure to slip, revealing beneath it an exhaustion that seemed to encompass both body and soul. She moved toward him, unable to prevent herself, though she maintained a distance that propriety would not forbid. "You have prevailed," she said softly. "We have prevailed," he corrected. "Without you, without your courage and your integrity, this outcome would have been impossible. Yet Clara," he paused, and his eyes held hers with such intensity that she felt her knees weaken. "Understand what has transpired today. The committee has seen the evidence. By tomorrow, the entire county will know that you were present here, that you were instrumental in exposing this fraud. Your name will be linked to mine in ways that cannot be mitigated by careful framing or strategic presentation. I understand, Clara replied. Do you? His voice was rough with emotion. The whispers will suggest impropriety. The gossip will grow until it consumes everything we have built. I cannot promise you that your reputation will survive unscathed. What I can promise is that when this storm has passed, when time has allowed for the truth to settle into the consciousness of society, I will stand beside you and declare before God and man what you mean to me. But until then, Clara, until then, we must endure separation. We must appear distant. It will be agony, but it is the price of ensuring that your character emerges unblemished from this trial. Clara felt tears rise in her eyes, but she did not allow them to fall. Instead, she lifted her chin and met his gaze with the same determination she had displayed when crossing the moor in the storm. Then we shall endure it together, she said, in silence, if necessary, in faith, always. The library door opened then, and servants entered to clear the space, returning it to its ordinary state. A library, not a courtroom, not a battleground. Yet everything had changed. Everything would continue to change. And in the space between them, unspoken but utterly present, was the promise of something that transcended the careful protocols of their age. 3 weeks passed in an agony of careful distance. The scandal erupted precisely as the Duke had predicted, consuming the local newspapers and generating speculation that ranged from the plausible to the utterly scandalous. The inquiry had proven conclusively that Vickers and Crane had perpetrated systematic fraud. Both men had fled rather than face legal consequence. Reginald Ashworth, his position undermined by the revelation of his associate's perfidy, had withdrawn to his country house with his ambitions in ruins. Yet the victory felt hollow to Clara, for it had come at a cost that her heart felt acutely. The Duke had maintained absolute propriety. When Clara attended the village church, a journey that required considerable courage given the Reverend's continued murmurs of suspicion, the Duke sat across the aisle, his attention fixed upon the sermon with apparent concentration. When on one occasion their eyes had met briefly, he had simply inclined his head with the kind of acknowledgement one might offer to any respected acquaintance. Clara had thrown herself into her work at the schoolhouse, grateful for the distraction of her students and the familiar rhythms of instruction. Yet in quiet moments, she found herself wondering if what had passed between them in the library had been merely the product of crisis, an intensity born of danger that would evaporate once normalcy returned. Then came the letter. It arrived one afternoon, delivered by a servant from the hall, addressed in the Duke's unmistakable handwriting, to Miss Clara Harbury for her private consideration. Her father had been occupied with an examination, and she had taken the letter to her chamber to read in solitude. The handwriting was familiar now. She had studied the Duke's correspondence with the intensity of one memorizing sacred text, yet the contents struck her with the force of a revelation. My dearest Clara, I write to you under cover of darkness, in a chamber where no eye may observe me, because the restraint I have maintained these 3 weeks has become a burden that threatens to overturn my sanity. You have demonstrated a courage that shames my own hesitation. You have endured the scrutiny of an entire village with dignity and grace. I can do no less than match your bravery with my own. The committee's final report concludes that you acted with unimpeachable integrity and heroic selflessness. Lord Pemberton himself declared in my hearing that you are a woman of exceptional character. The scandal that attaches to your name is entirely manufactured by the envious and the small-minded. By all standards that matter, your reputation has not merely survived, it has transcended the ordinary bounds of respectability and entered into the realm of genuine honor. This knowledge emboldens me to speak what I have been constrained to contain. Clara, I am deeply and irrevocably in love with you, not because of the service you rendered, though that rendered you visible to me in ways that mere social convention never could. I love you because of who you are. A woman of uncompromising principle, of quiet strength, of a tenderness that is all the more powerful for being reserved. I love you with every fiber of my being, and I believe, no, I know that you harbor some reciprocal feeling, however carefully you have concealed it. In 4 days' time, there is to be an assembly in the village. I shall attend. I shall ask you to dance with me, knowing full well that such a gesture will be observed, interpreted, and discussed throughout the county. I do this not to force your hand, but to declare publicly what has already been declared in the privacy of my heart. You have given me your truth, Clara. I now give you mine. Whatever consequences follow shall be borne willingly, joyfully, for the alternative, a life of endless distance from you, is simply intolerable. Yours in love and unwavering devotion, Edmund. Clara read the letter 3 times, then held it to her heart, allowing the tears she had been containing for 3 weeks to finally fall. The words burned within her like a sacred flame. I am deeply and irrevocably in love with you. She understood, with the clarity of one who has endured sufficient uncertainty, what his letter represented. It was a declaration made with full consciousness of its implications. It was a choice to abandon caution, to place his own reputation in her hands, to trust that their love was sufficient armor against whatever judgment might arise. She took pen and paper and wrote her response with hands that trembled. My dearest Edmund, your letter arrived like dawn breaking after endless night. I have read it until the paper has worn thin, and each reading confirms what my heart has known since the moment you first spoke my name. I love you. I love you with a constancy that neither distance nor propriety can diminish. I love you as a woman loves a man she recognizes as the keeper of her truest self. Yes, I will dance with you at the assembly. Let the world observe, let it interpret, let it judge. For I have learned that the opinion of others is merely noise, beautiful sometimes, certainly powerful, but ultimately insignificant when set against the reality of what is true and essential and real. You asked me to be brave. I did so. Now I ask it of you, and I ask it not as a demand but as a prayer. Be brave alongside me. Let us face whatever comes together. I love you, Edmund Ashworth. I have loved you since the moment you placed yourself between me and the Reverend's judgment. But it is not gratitude I offer. It is my heart freely given, entirely yours. Clara. She sealed the letter with her own hand and sent it back to the hall by the same servant, her heart both lighter and more terrified than it had ever been. In 4 days' time, the assembly. In 4 days' time, everything would change again. The Duke's letter, still warm from her own reading, she placed beneath her pillow, where it remained close to her heart through long nights of anticipation and longing. The storm had passed. Now came the aftermath, the clearing of the sky, the emergence of something new. And though propriety would demand caution, though village voices would rise in speculation, Clara understood that some moments transcended the careful protocols of age and circumstance. Some moments were simply true. The village assembly hall had been transformed by autumn florals, golden chrysanthemums, and deep burgundy dahlias arranged in deliberate profusion, as though attempting to mask the ordinariness of the space with aesthetic ambition. Candles cast their wavering light across the polished floors, and the orchestra, stationed upon a modest dais, tuned their instruments with the kind of care one might accord to sacred ritual. Clara arrived early, dressed in a gown of pale ivory silk that her mother had worn at her own betrothal dance, a circumstance that felt neither accidental nor merely nostalgic. The dress possessed a timeless elegance, its high waistline and modest décolletage speaking to propriety, while somehow amplifying rather than diminishing the woman it adorned. Her hair had been arranged by Mrs. Linton herself, who had arrived that afternoon bearing gifts from the hall, roses for her coiffure, a simple pearl pendant for her throat, with a knowing smile that suggested the steward understood perfectly what this evening portended. You are lovely beyond measure, Miss Harbury, Mrs. Linton had said, adjusting a final tendril of hair. The Duke will be quite overcome. The assembly began with the conventional rituals, country dances where unmarried ladies promenaded with eligible gentlemen, where the careful machinery of village society maintained its rhythms and protocols. Clara danced with the vicar's son, with the solicitor's nephew, with various gentlemen whose names and faces blurred into an indistinct procession of propriety, and then, as the orchestra transitioned into a waltz, he entered. The Duke did not arrive unnoticed. His presence created a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere, a collective recognition of rank and authority. He wore formal dress of the highest order, black coat, perfectly fitted, adorned with the insignia of his station, white waistcoat gleaming in the candlelight. Yet what struck Clara most forcefully was his face, composed as always, yet bearing an expression of such focused intention that she felt her breath arrest. He moved across the assembly floor with deliberate purpose, and every eye in the room followed his trajectory. He approached Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, the widow of the former magistrate, who had been standing near the refreshment table, and engaged her in conversation with impeccable courtesy. But even as he spoke with her, his gaze found Clara's across the assembled crowd, and in that glance passed an entire conversation of longing and resolve. When the waltz began in earnest, The Duke excused himself from Mrs. Whitmore and walked directly to where Clara stood. The musicians seemed to understand the significance of the moment. Their playing intensified, became more passionate, as though the music itself conspired to create the backdrop for what was about to occur. "Miss Harbury," the Duke said, his voice carrying the formal distance of a man conducting himself with absolute propriety before witnesses, "would you honor me with the next dance?" The request was perfectly, impeccably proper, yet the electricity that passed between them, the weight of everything unsaid and now about to be declared, made the simple question resound with significance. "I would be honored, Your Grace," Clara replied, and extended her hand. He led her to the center of the dance floor, a placement that ensured they would be observed, that their dance would be remarked upon, discussed, analyzed. His hand found the small of her back, warm even through the fabric of her gown, and Clara felt her pulse quicken, as though her very blood understood what her mind had only recently acknowledged. This moment was a threshold. Everything before was prologue. Everything after would be consequence. The waltz carried them into its first sweeping arc, and the Duke drew her slightly closer than strict propriety would permit. Not scandalously close, any observer would find the distance defensible, but close enough that Clara could perceive the subtle scent of his cologne, could feel the warmth of his presence as a tangible thing. "You are extraordinary," he murmured, his voice low enough that only she could hear it beneath the music. 3 weeks of distance have done nothing to diminish what I feel. If anything, they have clarified it, burnished it, transformed it into something that transcends mere emotion and becomes instead a governing principle of my existence. "Edmund," Clara whispered, her own voice barely audible. "You should not speak so. People will observe." "Let them observe," he replied, and there was passion in his voice, barely restrained. "Clara, I have spent my entire life observing protocols, maintaining distance, performing the careful choreography that society demands of men in my position. But you have taught me that some truths are too significant to be imprisoned by convention. Some declarations demand to be made regardless of consequence." The waltz carried them past the assembled witnesses, the vicar, whose expression suggested profound disapproval, the Reverend Merrow, whose face had gone pale with fury, Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, whose eyes shone with romantic approbation, Lord Harrington, whose subtle smile conveyed both amusement and understanding. "After this dance concludes," the Duke said, "I intend to escort you to the garden entrance. It will be observed, remarked upon, perhaps even criticized, but it will also be understood. By this time tomorrow, every household in the county will know that Edmund Ashworth, Duke of Wexford, has declared his intentions toward Miss Clara Harbury. I do this not to trap you, but to offer you protection. Once my intentions are publicly known, any suggestion of impropriety regarding your character becomes not merely malicious, but absurd." "And if I refuse?" Clara asked, though she knew her words were false even as she spoke them. "If I ask you to wait, to observe more time?" "Then I will wait," he replied without hesitation. "However long is necessary, I will wait. But know this, my heart has already decided. My patience is merely courtesy extended to those who require assurance, but my love, Clara, is absolute and immutable. It will not diminish with time, it will only deepen." The waltz drew toward its conclusion, the musicians sensing the moment's intensity and extending the final phrases with exquisite artistry. The Duke guided her through a final sweeping turn, and as they came to rest, with the music fading to its ultimate notes, he bowed to her with a formality that was almost courtly. "Come," he said, extending his hand, "let us walk to the garden. Let every eye in this assembly understand what I am declaring without words." Clara placed her hand in his, and together they moved toward the garden entrance. Behind them, the assembly erupted into whispered conversation, shock, speculation, judgment, and beneath it all, a current of romantic recognition. What they had witnessed was not scandal, it was declaration. It was love made manifest in the ancient language of gesture and propriety. And as the cool night air embraced them, as the October darkness wrapped around them like a cloak, Edmund drew her hand through his arm and led her toward the rose garden, where moonlight painted silver across the sleeping flowers. "I will speak with your father tomorrow," he said quietly. "I will ask for your hand properly, with all the formality that tradition demands. But tonight, Clara, I need you to know with absolute certainty I love you, not because of what you have done, but because of who you are. Will you, when the time comes, when society has adjusted to the reality of our connection, will you consent to become my wife?" Clara turned to face him in the moonlight, and felt tears of joy rise in her eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Edmund. Yes to everything. Yes to you, absolutely and forever." He lifted her gloved hand to his lips, holding the kiss far longer than propriety would permit, and in that gesture Clara felt the totality of his devotion, passionate, deliberate, absolute. Above them, the October stars burned with steady light, as though bearing witness to a promise that no circumstance of earth could diminish. The morning after the assembly dawned grey and contemplative, as though the heavens themselves required time to process what had transpired. Clara had not slept, but neither did she feel exhaustion. Instead, she existed in a state of crystalline clarity, aware of every detail around her, the pattern of light through her chamber windows, the taste of tea grown cold upon her lips, the precise moment when her father emerged from his study, his expression one of mingled concern and unspoken knowledge. "Clara," he said, his voice bearing the measured tone of a man who understood the gravity of circumstance, "I have received a visitor. The Duke himself arriving with the dawn. He wished to speak with me regarding a matter of some consequence." Clara's heart stilled. "And did he— what did he— He asked for your hand in marriage," her father continued, settling into the chair beside hers. "With all the formality and respect that such a request demands. He spoke of you with such tenderness, such evident devotion, that I found myself moved beyond my capacity for words." "What did you tell him, father?" Clara whispered. "I told him that any decision of such magnitude must ultimately rest with you," her father replied. "But I also told him that I have observed your courage, your integrity, and your capacity for love. I told him that if you wished to marry him, you had my blessing and my joy." Clara felt tears rise, not tears of sorrow or fear, but of recognition that the future she had scarcely dared to imagine was now becoming tangible reality. "I do wish it," she said. "With all my heart, father. I love him." "I know you do," her father said gently. "I have observed it these past weeks, the way you turn toward any mention of him, the way your eyes search for him in crowds, the way you touch the letter he sent you as though it were a sacred text. Love such as this is rare, Clara. When it appears, it should be cherished, nurtured, celebrated." The implications of the Duke's morning visit, however, soon became apparent. By noon, the village buzzed with the news of his request. By evening, the vicar had called upon her father, his visit ostensibly one of pastoral concern, though his words carried the undertone of disapproval and barely concealed judgment. "The haste of this engagement is remarkable," the Reverend had said, his narrow features arranged into an expression of false concern. "One might wonder if propriety has been entirely maintained, if the appearance of respectability has not perhaps masked something far less savory." But to the Reverend's visible frustration, Clara's father had simply smiled. "Reverend Merrow, the Duke has behaved with unimpeachable courtesy. As for the haste, I would suggest that when two people recognize their suitability for one another, delay serves no purpose but to test the patience of the heart. My daughter will marry the Duke. I am honored by the connection and grateful that a man of such evident character has chosen to entrust his happiness to my daughter's care." The Reverend had departed without further word, his authority once again diminished in the face of an alliance he could neither challenge nor condemn without appearing petty. Yet beyond the village's judgment lay another more significant matter. The Duke called upon Clara in the formal drawing-room of her father's house, where the afternoon light filtered through lace curtains and propriety could be observed in its fullest manifestation. He brought with him a small box of aged rosewood, which he placed upon the tea-table between them. "I have not yet spoken to you of what I intend," he said, his voice carrying a formality that made Clara understand the weight of the moment. "My offer must be a proper one, made with all the respect that your character deserves." He opened the box to reveal a ring, not an ostentatious display of wealth, but rather an elegant simplicity, a diamond of considerable size, set in white gold, adorned with smaller stones of sapphire and pearl, arranged in a pattern that suggested stars. "This ring belonged to my mother," the Duke continued. "She wore it for 40 years, and toward the end of her life she gave it into my keeping with explicit instructions that I was to place it upon the hand of a woman worthy of it, a woman of integrity, of courage, of genuine virtue. Clara, I believe you to be that woman. Will you accept this ring, and with it my pledge to love you, to honor you, to cherish you for all the days of our lives?" Clara felt the magnitude of the question settle upon her, not merely the proposal itself, but the faith it represented, the future it promised, the complete transformation of her identity and station that accepting it would entail. Yet there was no hesitation within her, no shadow of doubt. "I will," she said, and extended her hand. As the Duke slipped the ring onto her finger, Clara felt a strange sensation, not merely of metal upon her skin, but of a door closing upon her previous life and another opening onto a landscape she had never permitted herself to fully imagine. She was to become a duchess. She would leave the schoolhouse where she had worked alongside her father. She would assume a position of considerable influence and responsibility. Yet what moved her most profoundly was not the transformation of her circumstances, but the profound simplicity of what the Duke's eyes held as he gazed upon her. Love, absolute and unguarded, offered without reservation or condition. "We will marry in spring," he said, "6 months hence, when the country is alive with growth and renewal. We will be married in the chapel that has witnessed the vows of dukes and duchesses for 3 centuries. And, Clara," his voice softened to barely above a whisper, "I promise you that every day of our lives together will be a continuation of this moment, a declaration of my devotion, a celebration of the courage that made you extraordinary, a gratitude that manifests itself in every gesture, every word, every choice I make." Clara rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the village beyond, the modest houses, the church spire, the market where she had been first humiliated and then vindicated. Her life in this place was ending, but not without legacy. She had proven her worth not merely to herself, but to the man who stood beside her, whose love had transformed her from an overlooked schoolmaster's daughter into a woman recognized as possessed of genuine virtue. The ring caught the light, and its facets threw prismatic colors across her skin, sapphire and pearl and diamond, each reflecting light in its own particular way, yet combining to create something greater than the sum of their individual brilliance. She was no longer afraid. The months between autumn and spring transformed the landscape of Clara's life, with the inexorability of seasons changing the countryside. The engagement was announced formally in the London papers, generating the kind of speculation that such unions always provoked. Questions about the Duke's motivations, observations about Clara's modest origins, whispered suggestions that propriety had been strained if not broken during their prior association. Yet the Duke's response to such speculation was to render it immaterial through the sheer force of his public devotion. He escorted Clara to social events in the county town, presenting her not as a woman of questionable reputation, but as one whose character had been proven in circumstances that tested the very foundations of virtue. He sponsored the establishment of a new school for the children of tenant farmers, Clara's school, the deed read, though she had protested the designation. He ensured that her name became synonymous with charity, education, and genuine care for the community. Lord Harrington had become an unexpected confidant and friend, helping Clara navigate the complex protocols of aristocratic society. It was he who coached her in the expectations that would attend her role as Duchess, who assured her that her modest origins were not a liability but rather an asset, evidence that the Duke had chosen his wife based on character rather than connection. "You understand," Lord Harrington had said one afternoon, as he reviewed with her the guest list for the spring wedding, "that his choice of you has fundamentally altered how society perceives the role itself. A duchess need not be born to the title, apparently. She need only possess the qualities that make the title meaningful. You have done considerable service to womankind by existing." Yet beneath the public rituals of engagement lay a private torment that Clara had not anticipated. The Duke maintained perfect propriety. They were rarely alone together, and when they were, he conducted himself with a restraint that spoke both to his respect for her and to the considerable cost such restraint demanded of him. At social gatherings he would stand near her, but never touch her beyond the most formal courtesies. In conversation, his eyes would hold hers with an intensity that seemed to burn, yet his words remained carefully distant. It was a form of exquisite torture, and Clara sensed that the Duke felt it equally. One evening in February, barely 2 months before the wedding, Clara found herself alone in the library of her father's house, a space that had become her refuge during the long winter months. The fire burned low, casting dancing shadows across the shelves, and she was absorbed in reading when the Duke's voice emerged from the darkness beyond the lamp's circle of light. "Forgive my intrusion," he said softly. "Your father granted me permission to bid you good night before departing. I could not resist the opportunity of a moment's privacy." Clara rose, her heart quickening at his proximity. "Edmund, you should not— The servants are occupied elsewhere," he replied, moving to stand before the fire. and this may be the only moment of true solitude we are permitted before our wedding night. I find I cannot face such deprivation without speaking freely at least once more." He turned to face her, and Clara was struck by the visible toll that restraint had taken upon him. There were lines around his eyes that had not been present in autumn, and his expression bore the exhaustion of a man engaged in continuous battle against his own desires. "Do you understand," he asked, "what I have endured these months? Standing beside you at assemblies, knowing that in 6 weeks' time I will have the right, the blessed, sacred right, to hold you without restraint. Conversing with you about weather and social obligation, when every fiber of my being wishes to speak only of love, of longing, of the future we will build together." "Yes," Clara whispered. "Yes, Edmund, I have felt it equally. The distance has become almost unbearable." He crossed to her then, and without touching her, brought his face close to hers. "When I marry you," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "it will not be a comfortable union of convenience or political advantage. It will be a marriage of complete devotion, of a love so absolute that it will define everything we do and become. I will cherish you not merely as a wife, but as the center of my existence, the reason I wake each morning, the answer to prayers I did not know I was offering." "Then wait no longer," Clara said, and reached for his hand. "Speak to me of it now. I need to hear it, Edmund. I need to understand the totality of what you feel, unconstrained by propriety or protocol." For a long moment, he simply held her hand, feeling its warmth and reality, as though reassuring himself that this moment was genuine and not merely the construction of his longing mind. "I love you, Clara Harbury," he said, and his voice contained such depth of feeling that it seemed to reverberate through the very air. "I love you with a love that is overwhelming and absolute and entirely consuming. I love the way you move through the world with quiet dignity. I love the intelligence that gleams in your eyes. I love your capacity for courage, for sacrifice, for moral clarity in a world that too often rewards expediency. When I am with you, I feel myself becoming better, more worthy, more capable of genuine goodness. You have changed me, Clara. You have made me understand that the greatest privilege of rank is the opportunity to elevate those one loves." He raised her hand to his lips and held the kiss for a long moment, and Clara felt in that gesture the passionate intensity that he had been containing for months. Desire, yes, but beneath it something far more significant: recognition. He recognized her as the keeper of his truest self. "After we are married," he continued, "I will spend the remainder of my life ensuring that no moment passes in which you doubt your worth to me. I will ensure that the world understands you as I understand you, as a woman of exceptional virtue, whose courage has transformed not merely my life, but the very fabric of my soul." Outside, snow began to fall, the last snow of winter, soft and gentle, promising that spring would soon follow. And in the library, lit by firelight, a man and woman stood together, hands joined, hearts finally permitted to speak their truth without restraint. In 6 weeks' time, they would be married. But in that moment, in the privacy of the library, with only the firelight and the falling snow as witnesses, they had already bound their souls together in a union that no ceremony could make more real. Spring arrived with the precision of a promise kept. The countryside exploded into renewal. Cherry blossoms adorned the lanes, primroses dotted the meadows, and the very air seemed to hum with the expectation of transformation. Yet none of this natural magnificence compared to the transformation that had occurred within Clara's heart and mind as the wedding day approached. The chapel of Wexford Hall stood as it had for 3 centuries, its stone walls bearing witness to generations of vows, celebrations, and the sacred moments when lives were irrevocably altered by commitment and love. The interior had been carefully prepared, not with the ostentatious displays of wealth that might have been expected, but with an elegant simplicity that reflected both the Duke's character and Clara's own preferences. White flowers, lilies, peonies, and delicate sprays of hawthorn adorned the pews. The altar gleamed with the patina of ancient wood, and above it, light poured through stained glass windows, casting jeweled colors across the stone floor. Clara waited in the vestry, dressed in the wedding gown that had been created by the finest seamstress in London. The dress was ivory silk, with Belgian lace at the sleeves and bodice, cut in a manner that suggested both modesty and exquisite elegance. Her hair had been arranged by Mrs. Linton with artistic precision, braided and crowned with a tiara that had belonged to the Duke's grandmother, adorned with seed pearls and small diamonds that caught the light like captured stars. The veil, delicate as spider silk, fell from the tiara to trail behind her in graceful folds, yet Clara barely perceived any of this. Her awareness existed in a state of heightened anticipation, every sense attuned to the knowledge of what awaited her beyond the vestry door. The man who loved her was waiting. The man for whom she had braved a storm, crossed the boundaries of propriety, and discovered the courage that had always resided within her, but had never been tested until necessity demanded it. Her father appeared in the doorway, dressed in the formal morning coat that had been tailored for this occasion. He studied his daughter with an expression of such profound emotion that Clara felt tears threaten, tears she could not shed, lest they compromise the careful artistry of her appearance. "My darling girl," he said, his voice trembling with paternal love and the recognition that this moment represented the culmination of a transformation that had begun months ago. "You are the most beautiful bride I have ever beheld, and I say this not merely as your father, but as a man who has lived long enough to understand that true beauty emanates from the soul. The Duke is fortunate beyond measure." "I am the fortunate one, father," Clara replied. "He has given me not merely a future, but validation of everything I have ever believed about myself. He has seen me, truly seen me, and found me worthy." The organ began its processional, the deep resonant notes filling the chapel and signaling that the moment of transformation had arrived. Her father extended his arm, and Clara placed her hand through his, feeling the tremor of his emotion, understanding that he too was undergoing a profound transition. He was releasing her to a new life, a new identity, a new sphere of influence and responsibility. The doors of the chapel opened, and light spilled forth, the crystalline light of a spring afternoon, filtered through stained glass and mingling with candlelight to create an atmosphere that seemed almost transcendent. The assembled guests, county families, the Duke's peers, Clara's father's modest circle of friends, rose as she appeared, but Clara's eyes found only one figure, Edmund, standing at the altar, dressed in formal mourning coat of deepest black, adorned with the insignia of his rank. His expression as he beheld her was one of such absolute devotion, such evident emotion, that Clara felt her breath catch. Here was a man, powerful, commanding, accustomed to authority over thousands of souls, rendered vulnerable by love. Here was a testament to the transformative power of genuine connection. The procession seemed to take both an eternity and merely a heartbeat. When Clara finally reached the altar, and her father placed her hand into the Duke's, she felt as though she were crossing a threshold into a realm where past and future merged into a single eternal present. The ceremony itself followed the ancient protocols, the clergyman's measured words, the exchange of vows that bound them not merely in law, but in the presence of God and witnesses. Yet what Clara would remember most vividly was not the formal language of the ritual, but the way the Duke held her hand as they spoke their vows, the slight tremor in his voice when he promised to love, cherish, and honor her, the way his eyes never wavered from hers, as though in looking at her, he was looking at the very center of his soul. "I, Edmund, take thee, Clara, to be my wife," he said, and his voice carried such intensity that even the assembled witnesses seemed to hold their breath, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish till death us do part. When Clara spoke her vows in return, her voice was steady, despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. "I, Clara, take thee, Edmund, to be my husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death us do part." The Duke placed upon her finger a band of white gold, delicately wrought and adorned with tiny diamonds that complemented the engagement ring with perfect harmony. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it with such tenderness that several guests visibly wept. "You may now kiss the bride," the clergyman intoned, and the Duke drew Clara gently toward him. His kiss was neither the passionate embrace that propriety would have forbidden, nor the perfunctory gesture that convention might have permitted. It was instead a kiss of absolute love, tender, reverent, containing within it all the promises he had made and all the futures they would build together. The chapel erupted in applause, and as the Duke led his newly created Duchess back down the aisle, Clara felt as though she were ascending rather than descending, rising into a future that only weeks before would have seemed impossible. The girl who had crossed the moor in a storm carrying a message that could save a life had become a duchess. But more significantly, she had become a wife, a partner to a man who recognized her worth and had devoted himself entirely to the expression of that recognition through love. The wedding breakfast was an affair of considerable splendor, held in the grand dining hall of Wexford Hall, where long tables groaned beneath the weight of delicacies prepared by the estate's celebrated cook. Yet Clara moved through the festivities with a strange sense of detachment, as though she were simultaneously present and observing herself from a great distance. She was a duchess now. The reality of the transformation had not yet fully integrated itself into her consciousness. The Duke remained at her side throughout the meal, his hand often finding the small of her back, his attention rarely straying from her face. At one point, Lord Harrington rose to offer a toast, words of genuine affection that spoke to the Duke's character and the remarkable woman he had chosen as his bride. "The Duke," Lord Harrington declared, raising his glass, "has always demonstrated an extraordinary capacity for discernment. He perceives truth where others see only surface. It is therefore unsurprising that he recognized in Miss Clara Harbury, now the Duchess of Wexford, a woman of exceptional character and genuine virtue. I offer my sincere wishes for their happiness, and my certainty that the Duke has secured for himself not merely a wife, but a helpmeet of remarkable quality." As the afternoon progressed and guests gradually departed, Clara found herself increasingly aware of the approaching evening, the moment when she and the Duke would finally be alone, when the careful restraint that had governed their relationship for months would finally be permitted to transform into something deeper, more complete. By evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of violet and gold, Clara found herself in the Duchess's chambers, her chambers now, though the reality of that possession still felt surreal. The room was exquisite, pale blue walls adorned with gilt details, windows overlooking the rose garden, a bed of extraordinary elegance draped in pale silk. A chambermaid helped her remove the wedding dress, an operation requiring considerable assistance, and provided her with a nightgown of the finest white cambric, trimmed with delicate lace. When the chambermaid had finally withdrawn, Clara stood at the window, gazing out at the garden below. The spring evening was cool and fragrant, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the song of a nightingale, a sound so perfect, so laden with romantic symbolism, that she almost laughed at the poetry of it. When the Duke entered, he moved quietly, as though afraid of startling her. He had changed from his formal dress into a dressing gown of dark blue silk, and his face bore an expression of such vulnerability that Clara's heart ached with the depth of her love for him. "Good evening, Duchess," he said, and the title sounded strange when applied to her, yet also profoundly right. "Are you well? Are you frightened?" "No," Clara replied, and was surprised to find that it was true. "I am not frightened. I am anticipated." He moved to stand beside her at the window, and for a long moment they stood in silence, shoulders nearly touching, gazing out at the darkening garden. "I have wanted this," the Duke said quietly, "for longer than I care to admit. Not merely the physical intimacy, though God knows I have desired that with an intensity that has sometimes seemed almost unbearable, but this simple fact of being with you, of having the right to be with you, of no longer needing to maintain the distance that propriety demanded. That has been my true longing." "Then let there be no distance now," Clara whispered. "Let there be only truth and love, and the absolute honesty that propriety so often denies." He turned to her then, and drew her gently into his arms. His kiss was unlike the one in the chapel. It was deeper, more passionate, containing within it months of suppressed longing and the joy of finally being permitted to express the fullness of his devotion without restraint or concealment. What followed was not the frenzied passion of physical desire unleashed, but rather an intimate dance of tenderness and growing intensity. The Duke treated her with a care that spoke to his respect for her, yet with a passion that revealed the depth of his love. He whispered words of devotion and praise, his hands gentle yet reverent, his body communicating what words could not capture. And Clara, for the first time in her life, experienced the profound unity that comes when two people are entirely honest with one another, when love is expressed not merely in words, but in the vulnerability of complete physical and emotional honesty. She discovered within herself a capacity for passion that matched his own, a willingness to meet him with equal intensity, equal vulnerability, equal devotion. Much later, as the night deepened and they lay together in the silence that follows profound intimacy, the Duke held her against him, his fingers tracing gentle patterns across her shoulder. "I love you," he murmured into her hair. Not as a title demands, not as society expects, but as a man loves the woman who has saved his life, not merely from conspiracy and treachery, but from the far more dangerous threat of a life lived without genuine connection. And I love you, Clara replied, with a love that transcends everything I thought love could be. You have given me not merely marriage, but validation of my own worth. You have shown me that courage is not merely the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite fear for the sake of what one believes to be true. The Duke drew her even closer, and Clara felt in his embrace the completion of everything that had begun months ago when she braved a storm to carry a message to a man she barely knew. That act of courage had led to this, to a love so complete, so absolute, that it seemed to encompass not merely their future, but the very meaning of existence itself. 3 years later, the April morning broke clear and brilliant over Wexford Hall, the kind of spring day that seemed to justify the entire cycle of seasons. The gardens were alive with colour. The roses that Clara had planted in the first year of her marriage were in full bloom, their fragrance carrying on a gentle breeze. Yet Clara's attention was focused not on the gardens, but on the children gathered in the schoolhouse that had been built on the estate's grounds, a structure born from her vision and the Duke's unwavering support. She stood at the threshold of the classroom, observing the interaction between her husband and the tenant children who filled the room. The Duke was conducting a lesson in natural philosophy, his enthusiasm for the subject evident in the animated manner with which he explained the principles of light and shadow. The children listened with rapt attention, not from fear of his authority, but from genuine respect and affection. He was their Duke, yes, but more importantly, he was a man who treated them with the same consideration he would accord to the members of the House of Lords. 3 years. It seemed impossible that only 3 years had passed since that autumn night when she had braved the storm. In that time, Clara's life had been irrevocably transformed. She had become not merely a duchess, but a force for change within the county. The school that bore her name now educated the children of tenant farmers and village families. She had established a modest medical clinic, staffed by a compassionate physician whom she had recruited from London. She had worked alongside the Duke to implement reforms in the management of his estates, ensuring that the tenant farmers received fair treatment and that the profits from the land were distributed in a manner that reflected genuine care for their welfare. Yet what brought her the greatest joy was neither her public accomplishments nor her elevated station. It was the simple fact of her marriage, the daily reality of being loved by a man who recognized her as his equal, who consulted her on matters of consequence, who expressed his affection without reservation or embarrassment. The Reverend Merrow had departed the parish 2 years prior, his authority having gradually eroded as the village came to recognize the falsehood of his accusations and the narrowness of his moral vision. A younger clergyman now occupied the rectory, a man of genuine compassion who had become a true friend to both Clara and the Duke. As the lesson concluded and the children filed out for their midday meal, the Duke approached his wife, taking her hand in a gesture so natural, so habitual that it required no thought or conscious intention. "They are progressing remarkably," he said, gesturing toward the departing students. "The young Whitmore boy is demonstrating considerable aptitude for mathematical reasoning. I predict he will achieve great things if his education continues beyond what our modest school can provide." "Then we shall ensure that his education does continue," Clara replied. "We shall sponsor him for grammar school, and if he proves capable, for university. That is the privilege of our position, Edmund, not merely to enjoy advantage, but to extend it to those whose talent might otherwise remain undiscovered and undeveloped." They walked together through the gardens, and Clara found herself marveling, as she did regularly, at the transformation that marriage and love had wrought. She was no longer afraid. The anxieties that had once plagued her, fears of judgment, of inadequacy, of being fundamentally unworthy of love, had been slowly dissolved by 3 years of consistent devotion and genuine partnership. The Duke paused at a particular rosebush, the one that bore flowers of the deepest crimson, almost the exact shade of the wax that had sealed the letter she had carried through the storm. He plucked a single blossom and presented it to her with a tenderness that still, after 3 years, had the power to make her heart accelerate. "Do you remember," he asked, "the night you came to my study, drenched and determined?" "Every moment of it," Clara replied, accepting the rose and breathing in its fragrance. "It seems both a lifetime ago and merely yesterday." "I have been thinking about that night with considerable frequency," the Duke continued, "about the woman who walked into my home soaked and shivering, carrying evidence that saved not merely my reputation, but my very sanity. I have been thinking about the courage required to undertake such a journey, the faith that must have sustained you, the love that must have motivated you even then, when you did not yet understand that love in its complete form. Clara looked at him, seeing in his face the man she had come to know so intimately, yet who continued to surprise her with the depths of his feeling and the constancy of his devotion. "I did not love you then," she said quietly. "Not in the way I love you now, but something moved me, something that transcended mere duty or obligation. Looking back, I believe it was the first awakening of love, inchoate and unrecognized, yet nonetheless real and powerful." They continued walking, and their path led them inevitably to the chapel where they had been married. The great doors stood open, inviting, and they entered into the cool interior. The light through the stained glass windows painted the stone floor in jeweled colors, and Clara felt, as she always did in this place, the presence of something sacred, not merely the religious significance of the space, but the profound sacred quality of love itself. The Duke knelt before the altar, and after a moment's hesitation, Clara knelt beside him. They did not pray in words. They had moved beyond the need for such formality, but rather simply existed in the presence of each other, and the greater mystery that had brought them together. "I have something for you," the Duke said, rising and extending his hand to help her to her feet. From his pocket, he withdrew a small leather journal, bound in what appeared to be very old leather with pages yellowed by time. "What is this?" Clara asked, accepting the journal with some confusion. "It is the diary of my grandmother," he replied, "the woman whose tiara you wore at our wedding. I have been reading it recently, and I discovered something that seems almost prophetic. On the day she married, nearly 50 years ago, she wrote a passage that I would like to read to you." He opened the journal to a marked page and read aloud, "I have married a man of rank and position, yet what moves my heart most profoundly is not his title, but his capacity to see me, truly see me, as a woman of worth and significance. I pray that our children, when they marry, will have the wisdom to choose partners not based on advantage or connection, but on the recognition of genuine virtue. For it is in such pairings that love becomes not a luxury, but a foundation." The Duke closed the journal and looked at Clara with such profound emotion that she felt tears rise in her eyes. "Your grandmother was wise beyond measure," Clara whispered. "She was," he agreed, "and her prayer has been answered. You are the woman of genuine virtue she envisioned. You are the partner who has made me understand that love, true love, is not a sentiment to be indulged when circumstances permit. It is the central organizing principle of a life well lived." He drew Clara to him, and in the jeweled light of the chapel they embraced, not the careful, restrained embrace required by propriety, but the full and complete expression of a love that had been tested by adversity, refined by time, and proven absolute in its constancy. Outside, the April breeze carried the fragrance of roses, and somewhere in the distance a bird sang a song of spring and renewal. The storm that had brought Clara to Wexford Hall seemed like a distant memory, not forgotten, but transformed into something precious, the catalyst for a love that had irrevocably changed two lives, and in changing them, had created the possibility of infinite good for all those whose lives they touched. This was not the ending of their story, but rather the beginning of its true narrative. The years of partnership and devotion, of challenges met and overcome together, of love expressed not merely in grand gestures, but in the daily, consistent choice to honor and cherish one another. This was the legacy they would leave, a testament to the transformative power of courage, honesty, and love that asked nothing of the beloved except that they be fully, authentically themselves. In the tapestry of human experience, there exists a truth that transcends the boundaries of social station, time, and circumstance. The courage to be authentic is the rarest and most precious virtue one can possess. This story of Clara Harbury and Edmund Ashworth, the Duke of Wexford, teaches us that true nobility is not determined by rank or inheritance, but by the willingness to act according to one's conscience, regardless of the cost. Clara's journey represents something profoundly significant in the human condition. She began as a woman who by all societal measures was invisible, a schoolmaster's daughter of modest means, living within carefully prescribed boundaries of expectation and limitation. Yet when confronted with a situation that demanded moral action, she transcended those boundaries entirely. She did not ask whether society would approve. She did not calculate the damage to her reputation. She simply recognized that a grave injustice was occurring, and that she possessed the power to address it, and she acted. This is the essence of true courage, not the absence of fear, but the willingness to move forward despite fear, for the sake of what one believes to be right and true. Clara's courage was not the dramatic heroism of military campaigns or grand public declarations. It was the quieter, more difficult courage of a young woman who understood that doing the right thing might cost her everything she possessed, her reputation, her social standing, her very identity within the community she had always known. Yet she did what was right regardless. The story also illuminates a profound truth about love itself. Edmund's love for Clara was not based on her newly elevated station or the grateful admiration of a man rescued from peril. Rather, his love emerged from his recognition of her as a woman of genuine worth, a worth that was entirely independent of external circumstances or social position. He saw her, truly saw her, in a way that society had never permitted her to be seen. And in being truly seen, Clara was able to become fully herself. This is perhaps the greatest gift that one human being can offer another, the gift of authentic recognition. In a world that constantly demands that we conform, that we suppress our authentic selves in service to social expectation, the experience of being genuinely seen and accepted for who we truly are is nothing short of transformative. It is the antidote to the profound isolation that comes from concealing one's true nature. It is the pathway to genuine self-acceptance and the liberation that such acceptance provides. The Victorian era in which this story is set was a time of rigid protocols and carefully maintained hierarchies, yet even within those constraints, Clara and Edmund discovered that some truths are simply too significant to be imprisoned by convention. Their love could not be concealed behind the careful facades that society demanded. It had to be acknowledged, honored, and celebrated, not in defiance of propriety, but in the recognition that some realities transcend the boundaries of social protocol. But perhaps the deepest moral of this story is something even more fundamental, the recognition that we possess far greater power than we typically acknowledge. Clara believed herself to be powerless, a woman of no consequence, lacking the authority or standing to influence the circumstances that surrounded her. Yet when necessity demanded action, she discovered within herself a capacity for bravery, wisdom, and moral clarity that changed not merely her own life, but the lives of all those she touched. This speaks to something essential about human nature. We are all far more capable of profound good than we typically believe. We are all possessed of an inner strength that remains dormant until it is called forth by circumstance and necessity. The question is not whether we possess such capacity, but whether we will summon the courage to express it when the moment demands. In modern times, as we navigate a world that continues to demand conformity and threatens those who dare to be authentically themselves, this story carries particular resonance. It reminds us that the personal is often the political, that the private acts of individuals maintaining integrity and speaking truth are the foundation upon which genuine social progress is built. It suggests that we need not wait for permission or validation from society before pursuing what we know to be right and true. The story of Clara and Edmund is ultimately a love story, but it is not a love story in the conventional sense of the term. It is not about romantic passion, though passion certainly exists within it. Rather, it is about the profound transformation that occurs when two people recognize in each other not merely a romantic partner, but a fellow traveler on the journey toward authenticity and truth. It is about the healing that comes when we are permitted to be ourselves without fear of judgment or rejection. And it is an invitation to all of us to consider, in what ways are we concealing our authentic selves? In what circumstances are we choosing social acceptance over personal integrity? What might become possible if we found the courage, as Clara did, to honor truth above propriety, authenticity above convention, and love above fear? Dear readers and listeners, thank you for accompanying Clara and Edmund on their remarkable journey from separation to union, from secrecy to profound love. Their story is one of courage, devotion, and the transformative power of authentic connection. We would be honored to hear your thoughts, your feelings, and your reflections on this tale. Please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below. Tell us, which moment in their journey moved you most deeply? What aspect of Clara's courage resonated with your own experiences? How did this story inspire you to consider your own authenticity and relationships? Would you like to hear more stories from the Victorian era, told with similar richness and emotional depth? Your comments help us understand what stories matter most to you, and they contribute to a community of individuals who appreciate the beauty of historical romance, the power of love expressed with restraint and eloquence, and the profound human need for authentic connection. Subscribe to our channel to ensure you never miss a new story. Enable notifications so that you are alerted the moment we release our next Victorian tale, our next exploration of love, courage, and the transformative power of choosing truth over convenience. Share this story with others who you believe would appreciate its message. Help us build a community of listeners who understand that love stories are not merely entertainment. They are mirrors in which we see our own capacity for courage, our own potential for transformation, and our own hunger for authentic connection. We cannot wait to hear from you. On behalf of the entire creative team at Victorian Romance Audio Stories, we offer our heartfelt gratitude for your time, your attention, and your willingness to journey with us through the world of Clara and Edmund Ashworth. We are grateful for listeners like you who understand that stories have the power to move, to inspire, to transform, and to reveal truths about ourselves that we might not otherwise discover. Thank you for being part of our community. With profound respect and gratitude, the Victorian Romance Audio Stories team